So this is our second and final lecture on intelligence, Module 30, where we're going to talk about assessing intelligence. I kind of enjoy this cartoon. That's my boy Mark. He's 39, but he's already reading at a 42-year-old level. I have young children, and it's very funny how competitive people become. And you hear parents saying, oh yes, my child is 4, but they're reading at a 7-year-old level. But it's funny how that becomes moot at a certain point in our lives. So we talked about what intelligence was in the last lecture, and we also talked about that intelligence is largely based on the test that we're using. But we still continue to assess intelligence. So assessment refers to the activity and the instruments used to measure intelligence. But the challenge is in measuring intelligence is that we have to have valid instruments, so they're measuring what they're supposed to be measuring, and they have to be reliable, so that they'll measure the same thing over time, even if it's administered by different people in different situations. So why should we even try to measure intelligence? One reason is to study how and why people differ in ability, to match people's strengths and weaknesses to jobs and school programs, to help the survival of the fittest process by trying to select people who have the greatest abilities, which we don't necessarily agree with. This was the position of Galton, who was a eugenicist, who kind of believed in a supreme race. Obviously, we don't like that anymore, and that's obviously something that we don't want to do. Alfred Binet was one of the first people to talk about measuring intelligence and its relationship to school achievement. He was from France, and in France there was a new law that required universal education even for those without the ability to succeed with current instruction. So he wanted a way to devise tests for children to help determine which kids needed additional help aside from the instruction that was already given. And so he hoped to develop a way of measuring the ability to predict a child's success in regular education. So, does our intelligence grow with age? Binet assumed that all kids followed the same course of development, with some going more quickly and others going more slowly. And so he attempted to do what was called the mental age. So how far or where on the normal curve did the child fall? So a normal 4-year-old should be able to do X, Y, and Z. So in relation to the normal 4-year-old, where is this child falling, above and below? We still do that to this day. The implication was that children with lower abilities were delayed with a mental age below their chronological age and not disabled, that with help they could improve. So Louis Terman of Stanford University used Alfred Binet's tests and added new items and extended the age range into adulthood. He also tested many California residents to develop new norms. So that's, the more people that you have in your normative sample, the more accurate it is. And so you want to see how people typically perform on these tests in order to make these age norms. And as a result of that, you've probably heard about the Stanford Binet intelligence test. Excuse me here. A little interference. So William Stern's scoring of the Stanford Binet test resulted in the concept of IQ, or the intelligence quotient. Binet reported scores as simply one's mental age. So a 10-year-old with below average intelligence might have the mental age of an 8-year-old. But he used it as a ratio quotient. So mental age divided by chronicle age times 100, and that's what's kind of was known as our IQ. So what IQ score do you get for somebody who has a mental age of 8 and an actual age of 10? Let me get my calculator here, times 100, because I can't do that in my head. Somebody has an IQ of 80, so that's in the low, below average range. So what do the scores mean? So Terman began with a different assumption than Binet. So Terman felt that intelligence was unchanging, that it was an innate genetic trait, and that people were born with a certain amount of intelligence and it didn't change over time. He saw that people's scores could affect their level of education, their familiarity with language, and could also be affected by the culture in which the test was used. So what do you do if you score low on an IQ test? According to Binet, you would study and develop self-discipline and improve your attention span. According to Terman, you would remove your genes from the genetic pool because this was something that is innate and could not change. So one of the things that we struggle with today is whether we're using these tests to measure aptitude versus achievement. So achievement tests are tests that measure what you've already learned. So these are like driver's license exams, the final exam. So this is like where you're kind of reviewing material and I'm testing to see whether you know that material. Aptitude tests attempt to predict your ability to learn new skills. So the SAT, ACT, and GRE are supposed to predict your ability to do well in the future. So here's a graph of SAT scores versus IQ. So you should see this should actually be a straight positive line. And you can see that especially towards the higher and lower ends, there's a lot of chunking in, so that people with really high SAT scores aren't necessarily more intelligent than people with, somewhat lower IQ scores. So you can see that people who are scoring 1100 and people that are scoring 1600 on the SAT can have IQs around the 120 range, which is obviously above average, but there's not a lot of variability there. So they're not doing their job at predicting necessarily success with any degree of accuracy. So I mentioned in one of the other lectures about Wechsler's intelligence tests. So the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Test and the Wechsler Intelligence Test Scale for Children, the WAIS and the WISC, generally measure the G, so we talked about that last time. And they have subscores for verbal comprehension, processing speed, perceptual organization, and working memory. Those of you who've ever taken the IQ test will remember some of these blocks, and so you have to try to make the blocks to match the picture, and that's kind of like your perceptual organization. So in order to have a good test, we have to adhere to the principles of test construction. So they have to be standardized, reliable, and valid. And so many intelligence tests create raw scores based on the number of answers correct, but then we turn this into a standardized score by comparing them, people's scores to those of the general population. And so Stern compared our intelligence score by finding other people with a similar mental age and to find the average. A newer method of generating intelligence test scores is to determine where your raw score falls in a distribution of scores by people with the same chronological age. So intelligence tests based on the intelligence scores based on the intelligence test follow what's called a normal curve, where the mean score on the test should be 100. And then most people score within one standard deviation, so that's plus or minus 15 points. So people can range from 85 to 115 and still be in the normal range. 2 standard deviations, you'll see that 95% of the people fall within 2 standard deviations, and that there's only a small percentage of individuals who score above those 2 standard deviations. So the top 2% and the lower people who fall below 2% are generally considered to be mentally retarded, and the people in the top 2% are generally considered to be intellectually gifted. So restandardization and the Flynn effect. So retesting a sample of the general population to make updated, accurate comparison group because we're finding that people are performing better than they used to. So you can see that people's tests on the intelligence scores are increasing over time. So does that mean we're becoming more intelligent? This is known as the Flynn effect, and because performance on intelligence tests has improved over the years worldwide. So you took an intelligence test last week and you were assigned the number of 120. Then after decades of the Flynn effect, the test was restandardized this week. Today you took the same test and got exactly the same number of items correct. But your new intelligence test score is most likely to be, would actually be 105, because we're saying that the intelligence test increases over time, and therefore you bring back kind of to the renorm, it would actually be lower. Reliability and validity. So this is very important when we talk about test construction. A reliable test means that it consistently gives you the same result. So if we use a ruler and measure the same thing, we're always going to measure it the same, it's always going to be 2 inches long, so all rulers should be the same. Split half reliability. The 2 halves of the test yield the same result. Assuming they measure the same thing, if it's a multiple choice test, you should get generally the same score in the first half of the test as you do in the second half of the test. Hello? Speaking. Great. Thank you so much. Bye. Sorry, forgive me. I couldn't pause it there, so you will forgive me for this light interruption. Test retest validity. Well, the test give the same result if used again. Depending on the test, people might do better the second time around because they may memorize the results. But if I give you a test 6 months apart, generally, if it measures something consistent, you should get the same score. So if your height was made of a ruler made with stretchy material, would that be a problem? Obviously, because depending on how much of a stretch there was, you could then get more or less. Your height would be different depending on how much people stretched. A test has a measure or validity if it accurately measures what it's supposed to be measuring. So content validity is whether the test correlates well with the relevant criteria or trait or behavior. So if we have somebody who is depressed and we give them a test of depression, is that what it's measuring? Predictive validity tests the ability of a test to measure performance on some future indicator. So with my sex offender research, we have measures that see to what degree we predict that somebody is going to reoffend. If your height was measured with a yardstick on which the units were too small, what would be the problem? We wouldn't be able to accurately measure ourselves, and so we wouldn't actually know what our height was, so it wouldn't be a valid measure. So predictive validity only in broad ranges. We're not the best at predicting things. We can generally see, whether somebody is going to do well. For example, at higher range of weights and success, weight is less a valid predictor of success of a football lineman. So, at a certain point, while it's good to be bigger to be a lineman, it doesn't necessarily mean the bigger you are, the more successful you're going to be. So there's a point at which that kind of bottoms out. So are intelligence tests stable or do they change with age? There are differing reviews. Using cross-sectional studies, which means that you test people at different points in time, but you test them all at once, older adults do not perform as well as younger adults on intelligence tests. So if I was to test older adults and I was to test younger adults, the older adults would perform more poorly than the younger adults. What factors could explain this? So are we thinking about the Flynn effect? And also, intelligence tests measure what they measure, and we learn different things in school, and so those things might affect things other than chronological age. Evidence for stability is that people who have, if you measure the same person over multiple periods of time, you see that their intelligence remains more or less the same, and there's actually a cohort effect, meaning that you'll see the same group of people that their intelligence stays consistent, but that those cohorts or those groups vary across time. So people who in the 1920s may have lower scores on IQ tests than people in the 1950s, etc. So this method yields evidence that intelligence remains stable or even increases over time. But again, the limits of this is in terms of the methods that we use. So here are some graphs suggesting that using the longitudinal method, scores maintain their relative consistency, but see if we look at cross-sectional designs, there's a significant decrease over time. So stability of intelligence over aging. Which types of intelligence stay more stable and which ones go more quickly? So we see that reasoning, spatial visualization, memory, and speed decrease with our age, but our vocabulary stays consistent over time. So you've probably heard about fluid and crystallized intelligence. So fluid intelligence refers to the ability to think quickly and abstractly, whereas crystallized intelligence refers to accumulated wisdom, knowledge, expertise, and vocabulary. So which one would you expect to change with time? Yes. So we would expect that our crystallized activity somewhat decreases with time, but we do have our fluid intelligence. So pushing toddlers to learn doesn't necessarily seem to help much. By the age of 4, a child's performance on an intelligence test is a predictor of their future performance. So, as much as we can push our kids, their intelligence is somewhat innate. In a Scottish longitudinal study, 8-year-olds with higher intelligence test scores lived longer and more independently and were less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. And in a study of nuns, those with lower verbal ability were more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease, which includes a shorter lifespan. What people say is that, because remember we talked about people who are more intelligent have more gray and white matter, so that as the dementia progresses, the evidence of the dementia is less evident in those with more gray and white matter. It also could be related to how well people take care of themselves, that people who are more intelligent have more money perhaps and have more ability to eat better foods and have more time for exercise, etc. So we talked about earlier the very extremes of the intelligence. So people below 70 are considered intellectually disabled, and people who are above 130, which is 2 standard deviations, are considered to be intellectually gifted. So intellectual disability refers to people who have an IQ of 70 or below, have difficulty with adaptive skills such as literacy and calculations, social skills, and ability to kind of do the basic things of daily living, so they couldn't take care of themselves without anybody's help. Although some people with high intelligence test scores can seem socially delayed or withdrawn, most people are successful who have those very high IQs. Gifted kids, like any other kids, learn best with appropriate level of challenge, but they found that people who go to gifted programs, however, it's often unfairly widening the achievement gaps, and it's important to kind of keep them in mainstream classes. So that is the end of this lecture, so please contact me with any questions or concerns, and I again apologize for the interruption.